It's something we're all, either experiencing or definitely heading towards,
Right.
getting older.
Right.
And when you look at the actual numbers, it's pretty significant. Back in 2014, almost 15% of people in the U.S. were 65 or older. That's over 46 million people.
Wow, yeah.
And projections, they show that by 2030, we'll be past 70 million. And by 2060, close to 100 million.
That's a huge shift.
It really is.
Yeah.
So with so many people in their later years, there's understandably a huge interest in how to keep them healthy and, well, feeling their best.
Absolutely. And in that quest for well-being, we're diving into a really interesting therapy today. Hyperbaric oxygenation.
HBO.
Or HBO, yeah.
Sounds quite high-tech, doesn't it?
It kind of does, yeah. But the basic idea is, well, quite simple, really.
Okay.
It's a treatment where someone breathes pure oxygen, but inside a pressurized environment.
Right. Picture it like being maybe underwater in terms of pressure, but instead of water, you're surrounded by pure oxygen.
Exactly. That's a good way to think about it. And our goal with this deep dive is to really pull out the most important information about how HBO might be used, to help with health issues common as we age.
Based on the material we've got here.
Right. Based on our sources, we want to give you a clear picture of what it could potentially do and maybe where it's not the answer without getting lost in overly complicated science.
Okay, sounds good. Let's unpack this then. So we're talking about aging and the kinds of things that tend to come along with it. Now, aging itself isn't really a disease, is it?
No, that's a crucial point. It's more like the stage where certain conditions just become more likely to pop up.
Right.
And to understand why HBO might even be considered here, it's useful to touch on some of the main ideas about, why we age in the first place.
Okay.
One of the big ones is the free radical theory.
Free radicals, the ones that get such a bad rap. What's their connection to getting older?
Well, this theory, first put forward by Harman back in the 50s and then developed more later, it's just that aging happens largely because of the ongoing damage.
Damage from these free radicals.
Exactly. They're unstable molecules, and they can harm our cells over time. And as we age, our bodies tend to, produce more of them.
And our defenses get weaker.
Yeah, exactly. Our natural defenses, our antioxidants, they tend to become less effective.
Interesting. And is there much evidence supporting this idea?
There is quite a bit, actually. Our sources mention studies looking at how life might have started, the effects of radiation, which creates free radicals, and even experiments where changing diets seem to affect lifespan in some organisms.
Right.
And what's fascinating is research in all sorts of creatures, from tiny yeasts to fruit flies, has shown this strong link between problems handling oxidative stress and their lifespan.
Okay.
And importantly for our topic today, free radical reactions have been linked to diseases more common as we age, things like atherosclerosis, Alzheimer's, even cancer.
Okay, I'm getting a picture of that connection. But I've also heard, that maybe free radicals aren't the entire story.
You're right, yeah. It's definitely more complex than just blaming free radicals for everything. Some more recent research suggests that, while they're definitely involved, they might not be the initial cause of aging. Instead, they might play more of a role in how our bodies respond to the damage that, builds up as we get older.
So a part of the process, but maybe not the trigger.
Sort of, yeah. It's
Yeah.
a connection, but the exact cause and effect, that's still being figured out.
That makes sense. So free radicals are one piece of the puzzle. What about this other idea you mentioned, hypoxia? A lack of oxygen being linked to aging.
Yeah, this is another way of looking at it, highlighted in our material, referencing Jain's work particularly.
Okay.
The thought here is that getting oxygen from the air we breathe all the way to our cells, it involves a series of steps.
Right.
And each of those steps can just become less efficient as we age.
Interesting. Can you give an example of that? Inefficiency.
Sure. A study by Bloom and colleagues back in '88 found that as people moved from their 30s and 40s into their 70s, the average amount of oxygen dissolved in their arterial blood, what's called PaO2, it dropped noticeably.
How much?
It went from an average of about 95 mmHg down to 77 mmHg. So the amount of oxygen readily available was lower.
Okay. But did the amount carried by red blood cells change?
Interestingly, no. The oxygen saturation, the percentage of red blood cells carrying oxygen, didn't significantly change.
So they still have enough oxygen attached to the cells, but the total pool of readily available oxygen in the blood is smaller.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now, this might seem to create a bit of a puzzle, right?
Yeah, I was just thinking that. If free radicals and too much oxygen could be harmful,
Right.
Why would we think about giving older adults more oxygen with HBO?
That's the logical question. Well, it's really important to remember HBO isn't intended to treat aging itself. And the pressures typically used usually between 1.5 and 2 atmospheres absolute, or ATA. They aren't generally high enough to cause widespread oxygen toxicity, at least not in the short term.
Okay.
Plus, as the source mentions, sometimes antioxidants like vitamin E are used alongside it, sort of as a protective measure.
Gotcha. So it's not about flooding the system to turn back the clock. What's the actual goal then with HBO for older adults?
The main goal is really to counteract that hypoxia at the tissue level, the lack of sufficient oxygen right in the cells, and also to improve overall metabolism.
Okay.
And these factors are especially important when we're talking about the brain.
The brain. Yeah, that makes sense. We hear so much about how the brain changes as we get older.
Right.
What are some key physical changes our source material points out?
Well, the most obvious one is a decrease in size and weight.
Really?
Yeah. The brain typically hits its peak weight around age 20, maybe 1,400 grams or so.
Okay.
And then it gradually starts to lose mass. By the time someone's 90, they might have lost, say, 20% of that weight.
20%. Wow. Does it shrink evenly?
No, not really. The loss is most significant in the outer layer, the cerebral cortex, especially in the front part, the frontal lobes, and a deeper structure involved in coordination, the dentate nucleus, that can shrink quite a bit, maybe 29%. But the brainstem controlling basic life functions, very little change there.
So it's quite specific.
Yeah.
And this loss of brain tissue, what's actually happening at a more detailed level, like cell-wise?
Right, so the loss mainly affects the gray matter. That's where the main bodies of the nerve cells are.
Both on the surface and deeper in.
Yeah, cortical and subcortical gray matter. And this loss can lead to the fluid-filled spaces inside the brain, the ventricles getting larger. You can actually see this on brain scans, like CT or MRI.
And does that shrinkage matter functionally?
Well, it seems to. Research has shown a link between brain size, or volume, and cognitive abilities, both earlier in life and later on. So while we might not be losing vast numbers of the cells themselves, the efficiency of the whole network might decline, and that could make it more susceptible to, say, oxygen deprivation.
Which brings us back to HBO potentially helping?
Potentially, yeah, in supporting function in those cases.
And what about the neurons themselves, the brain cells? Are we losing huge numbers of them as we typically age?
That's actually a common misconception.
Oh.
The current thinking is that the total number of neurons in the cerebral cortex stays relatively stable, assuming no underlying disease.
So they don't just die off in droves?
Not generally, no. In fact, because the overall brain volume shrinks a bit, the density of neurons might even slightly increase in some areas.
Yeah.
Widespread neuron loss isn't really considered typical aging. Changes tend to be more specific, certain brain regions, certain types of neurons, and importantly, there's no proof we grow new neurons in that outer layer, the neocortex, as adults.
Okay, so the structure changes, neuron count mostly stable. What about how the brain works? Like blood flow, energy use?
Yeah, this is where we see some important shifts. Studies using xenon-133 tracer techniques have shown a decrease in the average blood flow in the gray matter as we age.
But not the white matter.
White matter blood flow seems to stay more stable, yeah. Also, the brain's ability to regulate its own blood flow, that's called autoregulation, often becomes less effective after age 60 or so.
Okay, so it's less good at adjusting supply to demand.
Potentially, yes. And how the blood vessels respond to carbon dioxide, which is really important for adjusting flow.
Well, the source says that's a bit controversial, but it might also be reduced, possibly due to things like atherosclerosis, plaque buildup.
Right. So the whole system for managing the supply of oxygen and nutrients might get a bit less efficient.
That seems to be the case.
What about the brain's actual energy use? Does that drop off dramatically?
Overall, the brain's use of glucose and oxygen doesn't seem to be hugely different in typical healthy aging.
Really?
Yeah, but it can be affected by things like how socially and mentally active someone is, their physical activity levels too.
Changes in glucose metabolism are definitely clearer in conditions like dementia, but the key thing is the aging brain becomes more vulnerable to stresses that affect its energy supply.
Got it. More fragile in a metabolic sense.
Exactly. And there are other metabolic shifts happening too.
Like what?
Well, we see an increase in waste products inside neurons, more calcium inside the cells, which can trigger damaging processes, more of a signaling molecule called extracellular glutamate, and circling back to our earlier point, increased production of free radicals.
Right.
The source also mentions this concept of a metabolic triad in the aging brain.
The triad.
Yeah, involving how the mitochondria, the cell's powerhouses, function alongside insulin signaling pathways, and another thing called J and K signaling. Think of it like key parts of an engine needing to work together smoothly.
Okay.
As we age, the coordination between these metabolic parts can get disrupted, and those disruptions can potentially lead to neurodegenerative problems.
So it's about communication breakdown within the cell's energy systems.
That's a good way to put it. And finally, ongoing damage to the DNA within those mitochondria, plus maybe a decrease in a key antioxidant enzyme called SOD, that could also reduce the aging brain's ability to handle metabolic stress.
Wow, okay. There's definitely a lot going on under the hood as the brain ages.
Make sure.
Now, we touched on hypoxia earlier. How does this potentially reduced oxygen availability link up with, say, mental decline?
Well, McFarland's theory, way back in the 60s, actually made a direct comparison.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, suggesting that the mental decline sometimes seen with aging might be similar in some ways to what happens when the brain doesn't get enough oxygen. Even if the ability to use energy isn't totally gone, the functional activity is definitely impaired by this relative lack of oxygen.
Okay. And our source mentioned something about a vicious circle involving blood vessels and Bicolo. What's that?
Yes, Icalo is amyloid beta protein. This is a really important idea connecting vascular changes and potential thinking problems.
So break it down for us.
Right. So as we age, brain blood flow regulation can get less effective, right?
We covered that, yeah.
And the blood vessels themselves can change. This can lead to this amyloid beta protein building up in the walls of small arteries, especially in the cortex.
And that's bad.
Yeah, it seems to be. This AB buildup can contribute to what's called neurovascular uncoupling.
Uncoupling.
Meaning the brain cell activity isn't properly matched by blood flow supply. Think of it like a traffic jam, where resources can't get where they're needed when they're needed.
Okay.
This might involve changes in brain support cells called astrocytes, which help coordinate that flow. The result: reduced blood flow, which can worsen neuron health and make them even more vulnerable to hypoxia.
And it's a circle because
Decreased energy use in the brain is seen early in Alzheimer's, maybe even before the app really builds up, but then the app itself seems to further reduce blood flow, so it feeds back on itself.
Yikes. That sounds like a real downward spiral.
It can be, yeah.
So given all of this complexity, where does hyperbaric oxygenation fit into the picture for older adults?
Yeah.
Does it fix this?
Well, first, it's really important to stress the source is clear. There's no evidence HBO stops or reverses aging itself.
Right. Not a fountain of youth.
Definitely not. And if we only thought about free radicals and potential oxygen damage, we might think HBO is a bad idea. But, as we said, the pressures used are generally safe, and the main goal isn't some kind of general rejuvenation flood of oxygen.
Okay. So what are the actual conditions where HBO is seen as potentially helpful for older adults, according to our material?
Right. Table 35.2 in our source gives a pretty clear list.
Like what?
Things like cerebrovascular insufficiency causing neurological problems like hemiplegia, weakness on one side.
Okay. Stroke-related issues.
Could be, yeah. Also as an aid to physical therapy and rehab, potentially as prophylaxis against stroke recurrence.
Preventing future strokes.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Also, cognitive disorders from mild issues to more major dementia if they're secondary to vascular insufficiency. So, caused by poor blood flow.
Got it. Blood flow-related cognitive issues.
Exactly. Then there's peripheral vascular disease, poor circulation in the limbs, chronic heart problems due to ischemia, and even, surprisingly maybe, photoaging of the skin, sun damage.
Photoaging. Okay, we'll have to come back to that one. But it seems like a lot of these involve ischemia, right? That lack of good blood flow and oxygen.
That's the common thread, absolutely. And that's where HBO's main benefit, increasing oxygen availability right at the cellular level, becomes potentially important.
Makes sense. What about its role in rehabilitation? You mentioned that.
Yeah, so while HBO probably won't make healthy older adults stronger or faster,
Right.
it can improve physical abilities in people limited by things like pain, paralysis, or muscle stiffness, spasticity, by getting more oxygen to those struggling tissues, potentially. And this can be really valuable because it might let them participate more fully in physical therapy.
Oh, I see. It enables the therapy.
It can, yeah. The source even mentioned sometimes doing PT inside the hyperbaric chamber, like in stroke recovery settings.
Huh. Okay. So if you get more oxygen to damaged tissues, it might help healing and recovery, making rehab more effective.
That's the idea.
What about the impact on mental decline? That seems like a big area of interest.
It is. And here, our source is quite clear. HBO does not seem to improve thinking or memory in healthy, active, older individuals.
So no cognitive boost for generally healthy seniors.
Studies haven't shown that, no. No benefit in attention, coordination, processing speed in that group, even at high pressures.
Okay.
And importantly, it also doesn't seem to help primary degenerative dementias, like Alzheimer's, where the main issue is the progressive loss of brain cells themselves.
Right, not designed for that mechanism.
Exactly. However, it can potentially improve mental function in people whose cognitive decline is primarily due to cerebrovascular insufficiency.
Back to the blood flow issue.
Yes, where reduced blood flow to the brain is a major factor in their cognitive problems.
So it's potentially helpful for thinking problems caused by plumbing issues in the brain's blood supply, not the kind of dementia driven by, say, protein buildup.
Precisely. And the source really emphasizes that HBO, when used for this, is often just one part of a broader approach.
A multi-pronged attack.
You could say that it might be combined with things like brain jogging.
Brain jogging, I like that.
Yeah. Basically, mentally stimulating activities, plus physical exercise, and sometimes medications aimed at improving brain function, like nootropics.
So what kind of mental exercises count as brain jogging?
Well, our source references Jain's work, suggesting anything that really challenges your cognitive abilities. Think puzzles, learning a new skill, a language, an instrument, anything that makes you think and problem solve.
Use it or lose it, basically.
Pretty much, yeah. Keep the brain active.
And physical exercise is also key, you mentioned.
Absolutely critical. It's known to reduce that age-related decline in aerobic capacity, how well we use oxygen. It might even help us live longer.
And benefits for the brain specifically.
Definitely. Physical exercise improves blood flow to the brain and how well it functions overall. When we exercise, our muscles release substances like ATP that can actually trigger changes in brain blood flow.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, studies using xenon tracers show increased blood flow in specific brain areas, prefrontal cortex, sensory motor areas during exercise. More blood, more energy use.
So the brain and body really are tightly connected.
Incredibly so. Exercise can help break that negative cycle where inactivity leads to lower demands on the brain, which reduces blood flow, potentially harming neurons, leading to more inactivity.
Vicious circle again.
Exactly. Our source even has a diagram showing how brain jogging, physical activity, and maybe nootropics can work synergistically with HBO.
How so?
Well, physical exercise improves mental function. Increased mental activity seems to improve physical performance. Both are linked to longer lifespan.
That's compelling.
Yeah, and there's even evidence that mentally active people tend to live longer and maybe have better survival strategies after something like a heart attack. And while it's not, definitively proven, there's theoretical support that regular physical exercise might help postpone the decline in the brain's oxidative capacity, its ability to handle metabolic stress as we age.
So it really is a whole body, whole lifestyle approach.
It seems to be the most effective strategy, yes.
Okay, what about that last thing on the list, photoaging of the skin? That felt a bit different from the others.
It is a bit different, yeah. Wrinkles, they're a natural part of aging. Partly genetic, partly due to decreased production of collagen and elastin, the stuff that gives skin its structure.
Right.
But external factors, especially UVB radiation from the sun and also smoking, can significantly speed that process up.
How does UVB do that?
It triggers enzymes in the skin, MMPs they're called, that actually break down collagen.
Okay, so how could HBO possibly help with sun-induced wrinkles?
The source suggests a possible mechanism. It seems UVB radiation ramps up certain pathways in the skin that contribute to wrinkles. Things involving inflammation, neutrophils, and angiogenesis, the formation of new, often fragile, blood vessels.
Angiogenesis is linked to wrinkles.
Apparently so. And it can be caused by both UVB and low oxygen levels, hypoxia, through pathways like HIF and VEGF.
Okay.
The idea is that the high oxygen levels during HBO might inhibit some of these pathways that UVB upregulates. By doing that, it could potentially reduce wrinkle formation caused by sun exposure.
Huh. That's fascinating. So interfering with the damage process.
Potentially, yeah. It's an interesting angle.
It really is. So not just internal benefits, but maybe some external ones too. Now, crucial question. Safety. Is HBO generally safe for older adults?
Generally, yes. The source indicates it's considered safe for older folks who don't have specific contraindications, specific medical reasons not to do it.
But there must be some consideration.
There are. One thing mentioned is cataracts.
Ah, clouding of the lens. More common with age anyway.
Exactly. And potentially linked to oxidation. Animal studies apparently suggest a link between increased lipid oxidation in the lens and opacity in HBO models.
So HBO could potentially worsen or speed up cataracts?
It's a possibility, yeah. The source notes that cataract development seems associated with prolonged HBO therapy. We're talking months to years of treatment, potentially.
Okay, so not typically from a short course.
Seems less likely based on this. It's something to be aware of, especially with very long treatment plans.
Definitely something to keep in mind.
It is, but it's also worth remembering, modern cataract surgery is very safe and very effective.
Good point.
And many older individuals might have already had cataract surgery anyway for age-related cataracts.
True. Okay, so let's try and bring this all together. What are the main takeaways from our deep dive into HBO and geriatrics?
Well, I think the main point is that HBO can be a valuable tool for certain health problems in older adults, particularly conditions where poor blood flow, ischemia, and lack of oxygen delivery are key factors.
Right. So, like for someone with cognitive difficulties, specifically because of reduced blood flow in the brain, cerebrovascular insufficiency, HBO might offer some actual benefit there.
Exactly. And for more, maybe general mental decline in older folks who aren't very active and don't have a specific organic brain disease,
Yeah.
the most effective approach really seems to be that combination therapy.
The mix of things.
Yeah. HBO, maybe some nootropic medications, definitely the mental exercises, brain jogging, and physical therapy or exercise.
It really does sound like combining strategies is often the best bet. And even if, we can't change our fundamental genetic lifespan,
Right.
these kinds of interventions can maybe help us live those years with better function, both cognitive and physical.
That seems to be the goal, yes. Achieving the maximum potential lifespan with optimal function.
And it's critical to understand, to stress this. There's no evidence that just giving more oxygen, normobaric or hyperbaric, is some kind of magic bullet, right?
Absolutely critical. It's not for rejuvenation, not for making older people younger. That's not supported.
So the focus remains on specific indicated medical uses, not general anti-aging. That makes perfect sense. So here's maybe a final thought for you, our listener, to ponder. Considering how interconnected all this seems to be, physical activity, keeping mentally engaged, how our bodies use oxygen as we age, what small changes in your daily life do you think could have the biggest long-term impact on keeping both your mind and body healthy and functioning well as you get older?
That's a great question to reflect on. It really brings it back to the individual.
It's definitely something to mull over.